Hi, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Um, the Odyssey is having something of a revival in English literary culture. Last year, Daniel Mendelsohn wrote a book about teaching undergraduates the epic, with his octogenarian father auditing the class. Madeline Miller, a high school classics teacher for 20 years, wrote a novel about the goddess Circe in which Odysseus appears. Since the epic was first read in English around 1615 in Chapman's version, there have been about 60 more English translations, half of them in the last 100 years and a dozen in the last 2 decades. Of all of these, Miss Wilson's is the first rendering made by a woman. Miss Wilson seems an apt person to have this long-belated honor. Born in Oxford, Wilson comes from a long line of scholars on her mother's side, and as a baby, she herself inspired the inception of a Somerville creche when a number of female scholars decided to insist on being able to continue their work and care for their children. Her mother was a scholar, her father the biographer and critic Anne Wilson, and her sister the food writer and historian B. Wilson. Wilson was the author of Mocked by Death, a study of the way mortality was imagined in the tragic tradition by Milton, Shakespeare, Seneca, Sophocles, and Euripides, and a monograph on Socrates. But the classicist Emily Wilson has taken on a translation of the epic poem that is at once formally conservative, written in iambic pentameter, limiting herself to the same number of lines as Homer's original, and yet radically inventive in her interpretation of the characters. I should just say this is my non-classicist reading of the matter. I don't read ancient Greek. I write fiction, and I'm shamelessly stealing from my friend Wyatt Mason's interview with Emily which I'll quote later. Okay, that's it for confessions. She's done away with Milman's Homeric epithets, the rosy-fingered dawn, etc., that were repeated to help the oral bards, I guess, remember their plot points. And that one decision takes away the fustiness and sort of old-school feeling that can sometimes accompany reading an ancient text. When Wyatt Mason, who profiled Emily, started writing about her piece, he considered her selection of a word in the first line, the first adjective that describes the hero, Odysseus. And what he did is he went through all 60 of the previous English translations and looked at how they translated the adjective polytropos, and which the Chapman version was with many a way wound in his wisdom. And then he lists the other translations, much versed, of many fortunes, of many a turn, tossed to and fro by fate, many-sided man, deep, sagacious, skilled in expedients, so ready at need, of craft renowned, adventurous, shifty, ingenious, so wary and wise, of many devices, restless, various-minded, never at a loss, of many ways, of many turns, of many wiles, cunning. In the 60 translations, there was no consensus. They ran from the positive, sagacious, versatile, to the negative, shifty, restless, cunning. Those who stuck closest to the Greek roots, poly, many, tropos, turn, didn't really get to a doubleness that apparently is in the original word. And the doubleness apparently suggests that there's a man who's either supremely in control of his life or one who has lost control of his life. And Mason says, of the existing translations, it seems that none get across to the reader without Greek, the open question that is in fact the opening question of the Odyssey, one that's embedded in this adjective in the first line. What sort of man is Odysseus? Well, here's how Emily Wilson opens her Odyssey. Tell me about a complicated man. She said to an interviewer, I wanted to have a sense that maybe there was something wrong with this guy. So the question, she continued, of whether he's the turned or the turner, I played around with that a lot in terms of how much I should be explicit about going for one versus the other. I remember that being one of the big questions I had to start off with. In addition to stripping the Homeric epithets, she peeled off a layer of euphemism, calling the women who work in Odysseus's home back in Ithaca slaves rather than the euphemistic housemaids or maidens. And just that one word lends a much more complicated feeling, speaking of complicated, to the scene when the young women are brutally hung by Telemachus after the carnage of the suitors. It makes the love affairs, though they're not explicitly dramatized, it makes our imagination of the love affairs which we know they've had with the suitors feel on a completely different orders than, say, the flirtation, to take one example, of Odysseus with the elite young woman, Nausicaa, who was the daughter of a king and of a queen. The whole question of what is that story, Wilson says, is going to depend on the language, the words you use. And throughout her translation of the Odyssey, she's made small, but it turns out, according to Mason, radical changes to the way many key scenes of the epic are presented. Radical in that in 400 years of versions of the poem, no translator has made the kinds of alterations she has. Changes that go to truing a text that, as she says, has through translation accumulated distortions that affect the way even scholars who read Greek discuss the original. I want to consider the other big questions Wilson had in embarking on this translation, and which were answerable and which had to remain mysterious, and how she drew that line between interpretation and invention. Please welcome Emily Wilson. Oh, and I just wanted to mention afterwards we'll have a book signing right outside, and we'll also have coffee, tea, and madeleines.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming, and thank you for that lovely introduction. So I wanted to start, I'm going to just talk for a few minutes just about my approach to creating yet another translation of this much translated poem, which I think you've already heard some of the issues that were at stake for me in deciding to add another one to the pile of over 60, now almost 70 translations in English alone. But then after that, I'm going to read 4 short passages of the poem, and then we're going to have conversation and then questions from the audience. So I was approached to consider doing a new translation of the Odyssey by Norton, with whom I'd worked on the anthology of world literature and Western literature. I was excited to be asked because I've always loved the Odyssey, which I read as this rich, endlessly fascinating poem about questions I think about all the time in my daily life as well as my scholarly life, like about identity, time, whether we can be the same person after 20 years, or in a new place, or with new people. It's about hiding, home, growing up, rage, grief, imagination, recognition. It's a poem which turns the details of everyday life, like beds, tables, chairs, weapons, trees, moving through space, into these richly resonant symbols that define both human and divine relationships. I love how the Odyssey is both so practical and down to earth, and also so magical, and how those things are so intertwined. But loving the poem in Greek is a totally different thing from thinking it's worthwhile to spend 5 years of my life composing yet another translation when there are gazillions out there. And of course, that's both a scholarly and creative and writerly project and an interpretative one at the same time. So then I did the experiment of just looking at a short passage in multiple different translations, and then I realized I thought the world did need another one. Because I felt that there were things that were essential to my experience of the original that didn't seem to me to be getting across clearly, and I thought I could try to get some of those elements across in a different way in English. So one set of things that I thought about right at the start that continued to be essential was to do with formal issues. The Odyssey is, as you may all know already, composed in dactylic hexameter. A dactyl is a finger. Everyone has a finger which goes long, short, short. La, la, la. And it's hexameter, so it's that six times over. Andramoi ennepe musa polutropon hosmala polla. Goes like that same rhythm with variations about how many spondies, how many dactyls there are, the same way for over 12,000 lines. It doesn't suddenly lapse into free verse when it feels like it. whereas most English translations from the last 50 years or so are either in prose or they're in free verse. So you don't get that experience of it has a regular rhythm. I didn't want to import the non-native meter of hexameter into English because I feel like experiments with doing that have never quite worked. So I used iambic pentameter all the way through to signal what I think is a comparable thing to what the original is signaling by using the standard metrical pattern for narrative poetry in archaic Greece. Second big formal thing was that I decided to make my version the same length as the original in terms of lines, because I felt that there's always this tendency for any translator, no matter of what, to make it longer. Because you always know this word could mean 100 different things, none of which is exactly the same as what the original means. So you always want to cover your bases by using 5 different words, but then you end up with a translation which is far longer than the original and much more slow going to read. And I didn't want to make Homer more slow going than the original is. And then in general, I wanted to avoid what I think has been this assumption that because English epic, since the time of Milton, since the time of Pope, has this heritage of its complex, subordinated syntax, it's heroic in the sense of bombastic, it has a highfalutin language, that's then infiltrated the way we imagine that epics from earlier eras ought to be translated. And I think that's actually problematic, because the syntax of Homer is so simple. It's folk poetry. It's designed to be easily comprehensible on first listening, such that you don't have to go back and reread and figure out what does that dense passage say. It's not like that. So I wanted to try to write in a way that would have a sort of aerated quality, that wouldn't necessarily be constantly stopping the reader to try and figure out what exactly does this mean. I was aware that I couldn't make my English both readable and quite as mixed as the original language is. The original is in a mix of different dialects from different parts of the Greek-speaking world, from different eras, because it's based on a long oral tradition. So in some ways, it would have been fun to do an English that was a little bit of Chaucerian, a little bit of California, a little bit of Glaswegian, a little bit of Cockney, and then just mix it all up and come up with a wonderful Joycean experiment. But I knew that I couldn't do that and also be readable and create an immersive reading experience. But instead, I wanted just to have an English that had a kind of plainness, but also had artifice. It's artifice both because we don't normally speak iambic pentameter all the time, but then also because I avoid all contractions like doesn't, don't, and I use some word choices that I hope are somewhat surprising, such that I don't want it to be totally neutral language. I want it to be an awareness that there's variety in how the language works from one scene to another, even from one line to another. In terms of repetitions and formulae, I don't actually get rid of all the epithets, but I do different things with them. The original is very repetitive. I keep, for instance, all the rosy-fingered dawns. She's always a goddess. She always has roses or flowers or blooming. She always has fingers or touching. But I mix up how those components work. Because it seems to me that in an oral culture, repeated components can have a different set of meanings from what they have in a literate culture like ours. In a very literate culture, if a writer repeats word for word over and over and over, you either think, it's Gertrude Stein, it's Gertrude Stein, it's Gertrude Stein, or else you think, more likely you're going to think, this is cliche, this is boring, she hasn't thought about it, so I'm going to skip, especially if I only have 2 hours before class. So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make sure that each word felt like it mattered. And to do that, I repeat less than the original does, though I do actually repeat quite a lot. I have quite a lot of wine dark seas, and then wine dark seas. In terms of process, I didn't look at other translations while I was working. And I actually, in retrospect, I'm really happy I didn't, because I've noticed how much the existing translations are echoing each other. I worked closely with the Greek, and I did a lot of reading out loud, both of the original and then of my drafts in progress, because making sure that it read out loud in a way that felt convincing was essential to what I wanted to do. In terms of grand vision, I wanted to bring out all the different perspectives within the narrative, all the different focalizations. I wanted it to be very clear, this isn't just Odysseus' poem. Odysseus is a fascinating, multifaceted character, But not everything in the Odyssey is about Odysseus, and his perspective on his story isn't the only possible one. It's a story about homecoming in which one man gets home and many men and some women don't get home. So I wanted it to be very clear that we see the complexity of that story by seeing how many different people it affects, some of them not very well. In fact, out of the 12 ships that Odysseus leaves to Troy with, none of those young men get back home. I think the original poem allows us to see and feel and understand inside the heads of multiple different characters who have multiple different voices. In the broadest outline, I wanted to create a version of the Odyssey that would be clear, readable, poetic, musical, and that would encourage and invite critical, nuanced responses to the story it tells. I've seen from teaching the Odyssey that there's this tendency to assume it's a kind of old-school comic book superhero story about the unproblematically heroic male Western hero, implicitly white, who is good because he crushes the bad guys, monsters, foreigners, and witchy women, and understands the value of hospitality, which apparently they cared about in ancient Greece. You write that on the exam. Story has a happy ending because the good guy gets back with the objectified wife and regains all his wealth, all his slaves. So it's a nice celebration of family values, consumerism, patriarchy, war, superiority of normal male white people over foreigners. And I don't think I would like the Odyssey if I felt that was all that was going on in this poem. I wanted to create a translation which would show how this poem includes multiple different voices and critique of its own dominant narratives. One concrete example is that I've been surprised to see how many translations in English use words like maids and servants and housekeepers for words which definitely mean slave in a totally unambiguous way. I think that desire not to use the word slave comes from a systematic blindness, which is motivated by the desire to idealize the society of Homer and simplify its ethical concepts. I love this poem partly because it has such a diverse and vast range of different characters, different perspectives, such a complex, ambivalent, troubling attitude to its own narratives. So now I'm going to read a few passages which I hope will illustrate some of what I've said, and then we're going to have our conversation and Q&A. The first passage I'm going to read is going to be the longest. It's from the middle of the poem, and it's in a way the most famous bit you know if you don't know the Odyssey very well. It's Odysseus is telling his own story in the first person of the tall traveler's tale. Of course, travelers very often have exciting things happen to them which aren't entirely realistic. He encounters, in this sequence, first the sirens, and then Scylla and Charybdis. So it's a passage which speaks to the danger of female mouths, female voices. The voices of the sirens, the six mouths of Scylla, Charybdis, who is all mouth. And also to the question of whether Odysseus can ever be a different person from the warrior who fought at Troy. Is he always going to want to go back to be that person, or can he somehow be somebody else? Sorry? It's going to be from book 12. I went back to my ship and roused the men to get on board, they're leaving Circe's island, and loosed the sternward cables. Embarking, they sat down, each in his place, and struck the grey salt water with their oars. Behind our dark-prowed ship, the dreadful goddess Circe sent friendly winds to fill the sails. We worked efficiently to organize the rigging, and the breeze and pilots sailed. Then, with an anxious heart, I told my crew, my friends, the revelations Circe shared with me should not be kept a secret known to me alone. I will share them with you, and we can die in knowledge of the truth, or else escape. She said we must avoid the voices of the otherworldly sirens, steer past their flowering meadow. And she says that I alone should hear their singing. Bind me, to keep me upright at the mast, round with rope. If I beseech you and command you to set me free, you must increase my bonds and chain me even tighter. So I told them each detail. Soon our well-built ship, blown fast by fair winds, neared the island of the sirens, and suddenly the wind died down. Calm came. Some spirit lulled the waves to sleep. The men got up, pulled down the sails, and stowed them in the hollow hold. They sat at oar and made the water whiten, struck by polished wood. I gripped a wheel of wax between my hands and cut it small. Firm kneading in the sunlight warmed it, and then I rubbed it in the ears of each man in his turn. They bound my hands and feet straight upright at the mast. They sat and hit the sea with oars. We travelled fast, and when we were in earshot of the sirens, they knew our ship was near and started singing. Odysseus, come here. You are well known from many stories. Glory of the Greeks. Now stop your ship and listen to our voices. All those who pass this way hear honeyed song poured from our mouths. The music brings them joy, and they go on their way with greater knowledge. Since we know everything, the Greeks and Trojans suffered in Troy by God's will, and we know whatever happens anywhere on earth. Their song was so melodious, I longed to listen more. I told my men to free me. I scowled at them, but they kept rowing on. Eurylochus and Perimedes stood and tied me even tighter, with more knots. But when we were well past them and I could no longer hear the singing of the sirens, I nodded to my men, and they removed the wax that I had used to plug their ears and untied me. When we had left that island, I saw a mighty wave and smoke and heard a roar. The men were terrified. Their hands let fall the oars. They splashed down in the water. The ship stayed still, since no one now was pulling the slender blades. I strode along the deck, pausing to cheer each man, then gave a speech to rally all of them. Dear friends, we are experienced in danger. This is not worse than the time the Cyclops captured us and forced us to remain inside his cave. We got away that time, thanks to my skill and brains and strategy. Remember that. Come on then, all of you, and trust my words. Sit on your benches, strike the swelling deep with oars, since Zeus may grant us a way out from this disaster also. Pilot, listen. These are your orders. As you hold the rudder, direct the ship away from that dark smoke and rising wave, and head towards the rock. If the ship veers the other way, you will endanger us. They promptly followed orders. I did not mention Scylla, since she meant inevitable death, and if they knew, the men would drop the oars and go and huddle down in the hold in fear. Then I ignored Circe's advice that I should not bear arms. It was too hard for me. I dressed myself in glorious armour. In my hands I took 2 long spears, and I climbed up on the forecastle. I thought that rocky Scylla would appear from that direction to destroy my men. So we rowed through the narrow strait in tears. On one side Scylla, on the other shining Charybdis with a dreadful gurgling noise sucked down the water. When she spewed it out, she seethed all churning like a boiling cauldron on a huge fire. The froth flew high to spatter the topmost rocks on either side. But when she swallowed back the sea, she seemed all stirred from inside, and the rock around was roaring dreadfully, and the dark blue sand below was visible. The men were seized by fear. But while our frightened gaze was on Charybdis, Scylla snatched 6 men from the ship, my strongest, best fighters. Looking back from down below, I saw their feet and hands up high as they were carried off. In agony, they cried to me and called my name, their final words. As when a fisherman out on a cliff casts his long rod and line set round with oxhorn to trick the little fishes with his bait. When one is caught, he flings it gasping back onto the shore. So those men gasped as Scylla lifted them up high to her rocky cave, and at the entrance ate them up, still screaming, still reaching out to me in their death throes. That was the most heartrending sight I saw in all the time I suffered on the sea. Okay, so then now I'm going to read a very short, heartbreaking passage. Odysseus, apologies for spoilers, does get back to Ithaca and is in disguise as a beggar. and he's being hosted by the noble slave Eumaeus, who takes care of the pigs. So in the context of a discussion of slavery, we have this encounter with the one member of the household who isn't going to survive, a friendly member who isn't going to survive Odysseus's homecoming, who's missed him for 20 years. So then, this is first Eumaeus is talking, the slave. Eumaeus says to Odysseus, talking about going into the household where the suitors are, "But do not stay too long. If someone sees you, you will be pelted, maybe beaten up." Unflappable Odysseus said, "Yes, I thought of that. You go, I will stay here. I have been hit before. I know hard knocks. I am resilient. I suffered war and being lost at sea. So let this be. There is no way to hide a hungry belly. It is insistent, and the curse of hunger is why we sail across relentless seas to plunder other people." As they spoke, Argos, the dog that lay there, raised his head and ears. Odysseus had trained this dog, but with no benefit. He left too soon to march on holy Troy. The master gone, boys took the puppy out to hunt wild goats and deer and hares. But now he lay neglected, without an owner, in a pile of dung from mules and cows. The slaves stored heaps of it outside the door until they fertilized the large estate. So Argos lay there, dirty, covered with fleas. And when he realized Odysseus was near, he wagged his tail, and both his ears dropped back. He was too weak to move towards his master. At a distance, Odysseus had noticed, and he wiped his tears away and hid them easily and said, "Eumaeus, it is strange this dog is lying in the dung. He looks quite handsome, though it is hard to tell if he can run, or if he is a pet, a table dog kept just for looks." "Eumaeus, you replied, 'This dog belonged to someone who has died in foreign lands. If he were in good health as when Odysseus abandoned him and went to Troy, you soon would see how quick and brave he used to be. He went to hunt in woodland, and he always caught his prey. His nose was marvelous, but now he is in bad condition with his master gone, long dead. The women fail to care for him. Slaves do not want to do their proper work when masters are not watching them. Zeus halves our value on the day that makes us slaves." With that, the swineherd went inside the palace to join the noble suitors. 20 years had passed since Argos saw Odysseus, and now he saw him for the final time. Then suddenly, Black Death took hold of him. Okay, so now I'm going to read after. So was a passage about both a dog and about slavery. This is after Odysseus manages to kill all the suitors who've been harassing Penelope. He then instructs Telemachus, his son, to kill the slave women whom he himself said earlier in the same book that were raped by I feel like love affairs is the wrong word, were raped by the suitors, and now they have to be killed, having done their work of cleaning up. So this is what Odysseus says. "When the whole house is set in proper order, restore my halls to health. Take out the girls between the courtyard wall and the rotunda. Hack at them with long swords. Eradicate all life from them. They will forget the things the suitors made them do with them in secret, through Aphrodite." Sobbing desperately, the girls came, weeping, clutching at each other. They carried out the bodies of the dead and piled them up on top of one another, under the roof outside. Odysseus instructed them and forced them to continue. And then they cleaned his lovely chairs and tables with wet, absorbent sponges, while the prince and herdsmen, with their shovels, scraped away the mess to make the sturdy floor all clean. The girls picked up the trash and took it out. The men created order in the house and set it all to rights, then led the girls outside and trapped them. They could not escape, between the courtyard wall and the rotunda. Showing initiative, Telemachus insisted, "I refuse to grant these girls a clean death, since they poured down shame on me and mother when they lay beside the suitors." At that he wound a piece of sailor's rope round the rotunda and round the mighty pillar, stretched up so high no foot could touch the ground. As doves or thrushes spread their wings to fly home to their nests, but someone sets a trap, they crash into a net, a bitter bedtime. Just so the girls, their heads all in a row, were strung up with the noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching for a while, but not for long. So I hope that's kind of harrowing. I'm going to end by reading a happier passage, which is the final reunion of Odysseus and Penelope. And even though I think this is a happier passage, I want to emphasize that I see in this passage that there's still a really clear-minded focus on how different the perspectives of Odysseus and Penelope are. That even though they're reuniting and they share some things in common, including a bed and a sequence of and a shared space, they also have very, very different perspectives, both on the last 20 years and on their marriage. So Penelope holds out against recognizing Odysseus, even after he slaughters all her harassers. But then he gets a bath from the slave woman. And then Athena poured attractiveness from head to toe and made him taller and stronger, and his hair grew thick and curly as a hyacinth. As when a craftsman whom Athena or Hephaestus has trained in metalwork so he can make beautiful artifacts, pours gold on silver, so she poured beauty on his head and shoulders. After his bath, he looked like an immortal. He sat down in the same chair opposite his wife and said, "Extraordinary woman, the gods have given you the hardest heart. No other wife would so reject a husband who had been suffering for 20 years and finally come home. Well, Nanny, make a bed for me so I can rest. This woman must have an iron heart." Penelope said shrewdly, "You extraordinary man. I am not acting proud or underplaying this big event, yet I am not surprised at how you look. You looked like this the day your long oars sailed away from Ithaca. Now, Euryclea, make the bed for him, outside the room he built himself. Pull out the bedstead and spread beds, quilts, and blankets on it." She spoke to test him, and Odysseus was furious and told his loyal wife, "Woman, your words have cut my heart. Who moved my bed? It would be difficult for even a master craftsman, though a god could do it with ease. No man, however young and strong, could pry it out. There is a trick to how this bed was made. I made it, no one else. Inside the court there grew an olive tree with delicate long leaves, full grown and green, as sturdy as a pillar, and I built the room around it. I packed stones together and fixed a roof and fitted doors. At last I trimmed the olive tree and used my bronze to cut the branches off from root to tip and planed it down and skillfully transformed the trunk into a bedpost. With a drill I bored right through it. This was my first post, and then I made the other 3, inlaid with gold and silver and with ivory. Now I have told the secret trick, the token. But, woman, wife, I do not know if someone, a man, has cut the olive trunk and moved my bed, or if it is still safe." At that, her heart and body suddenly relaxed. She recognized the tokens he had shown her. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him, kissed his face and said, "Do not be angry at me now, Odysseus. In every other way, you are a very understanding man. The gods have made us suffer. They refused to let us stay together and enjoy our youth until we reached the edge of age together. Please, forgive me. Do not keep bearing a grudge, because when I first saw you, I would not welcome you immediately. I felt a constant dread that some bad man would fool me with his lies. There are so many dishonest, clever men. That foreigner would never have got Helen into bed if she had known the Greeks would march to war and bring her home again. It was a goddess who made her do it, putting in her heart the passion that first caused my grief as well. Now you have told the story of our bed, the secret that no other mortal knows, except yourself and me, and just one slave, Actress, whom my father gave to me when I came here, who used to guard our room. You made my stubborn heart believe in you. This made him want to cry. He held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it, with great waves and driving winds. A few escape the sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land. So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
So I'll ask Emily a few questions, and then we're going to have questions for the audience. So I just wanted to ask you, I'm primarily, forgive me, a reader of fiction, but I wondered if you had a steady or a complete feeling about the characters when you started, or if that conception of character for each of them, I was thinking especially of the three central characters, but also of some of the minor ones, if that developed from your choice of words as you were struggling with the translation.
I think it definitely deepened and developed as I went on with it. I mean, I think maybe you can already hear from how I read Telemachus, for instance. My sense that it became clearer and clearer to me that I very much wanted to bring out how very young he is and how much he has that sense of himself as having been defined by being bullied all his life and being a victim all his life and being without a father, and that sense of loss. And I guess also in each case, I mean, it definitely became clearer to me as I went on with the project how vivid the characters who aren't those three central ones are. I mean, for instance, how vividly evoked each of the four central slave characters are, and that each of those was at least as important to get right in terms of do they make sense as a human being, as any of the other characters, including the goddess characters, also needed to make sense as, I'm not going to say as human beings, but as beings.
Was there anyone that you started with more of who was more of an enigma to you when you began?
Well, Penelope's always an enigma,
Yeah,
and
I think she's really.
I think she's meant to be an enigma, and I struggled a lot with should I sort of try and hint that in the scholarship on Penelope and the Odyssey, there's a lot of debate, for instance, about does she recognize him before she admits that she recognizes him? Is there some hint that, and do we have to think that in order to think Penelope has agency? We want women to have agency. She's smart, so she ought to have figured this out. She knew him for a little while 20 years ago, and yet she should figure this out. I don't think she necessarily does recognize him, because Athena is also very smart and goes to quite a lot of trouble to make sure she doesn't. But it also became clearer and clearer to me that what I wanted to bring out most clearly in Penelope was both that she's very veiled from herself as well as from us, and also that she's in a lot of pain all the time. And the dreams are constantly she has these wonderful accounts of her dreams, which bring out both her sense of abandonment and grief, and also her confusion, that I think she doesn't know what she wants. Maybe she wants to marry a suitor, maybe she doesn't. That those conflicting feelings are all there.
You talk about that at that moment where she shows herself to the suitors, and the ambiguity of that.
Exactly. So she does a laugh, and there's a much debated adverb. How is she laughing when she makes the decision? Which I translate as mysteriously, because I want to signal that I think it really is mysterious to us as readers or listeners, and also perhaps to her. So because she's being inspired by Athena, and how does that feel?
You sort of wanted to keep the mystery.
I want to keep some mystery. Yes.
It was interesting to me. I'm always especially from any other time period. And of course, this is a long time ago. But I mean, even a few centuries back, I'm always curious as to how much of the plot or the drama depends on the context that the audience brings. You know, and as a writer, you're always thinking, how much do you have to imbue with that? So I was fascinated to learn. I've read several other translations of the Odyssey and their introductions, and I never knew that it was actually a Homeric thing, that it was not absolutely a convention of the times, that she actually, you know, that in this case, if she had married one of the suitors, they would have gained her property, that was not usual for the Greeks. I found that fascinating.
I think it's also fascinating that the poem is not consistent about that, right? It seems like the poem also points to two possibilities. Either Penelope will marry one of the suitors and leave the house.
Yeah,
with one
she
of the
does
suitors,
mention that sometimes.
or else whoever marries her will get the house. And the poem is not consistent about that, which I also think is interesting.
And doesn't seem to explain why it would go one way in one situation or one way in the other. I mean,
Well, I think
just
the poem
depend
wants
on
to
how
have it both
strong the
ways
suitor is?
about how powerful is Penelope, right? She has to be both extremely powerful and have agency, but it also has to be clear that she might be put in a position where she no longer has any choice. And that whole question of does she have agency or does she not is at stake in the question of could she just leave and get another house somewhere else? Or does she...
You mean go off with one of the suitors and
with
go
the
off to
suitor,
his
yes.
house?
How much is that a possibility? Yeah.
It was interesting what you said about her work being analogous to her husband's and his handiwork, his building the bed and his carpentry, but that his work resulted in these accomplished projects, whereas hers was always being undone.
Hers
was
designed
all
to
process.
stop time. It's all process. It's all designed to stop time rather than to achieve something. I mean, in the description that I just read of Odysseus telling how he constructs the bed, one thing I think is striking is that, of course, this is constructing a symbol of marriage, and he constantly uses the first person, right? I made this. This is my bed. And then in her reply, she tries to use the plural and suggests she hoped for something together out of this marriage. But that's not how he describes marriage, but also not how he describes his achievements, that they're about what he manages to do himself out of the tools available, the materials available, whether it's the wooden horse or the raft to get away from Calypso or the bed to make his marriage somehow more permanent than any other marriage could ever be.
Was there, in the text, was there any hint ever anywhere of her reaction to his sort of massacre of not only of the suitors but also of the slave girls?
No, she doesn't comment. I mean, I don't know if you've read Margaret Atwood's great Penelope ad.
I haven't.
It's great, and it sort of goes into that question, and that question of shouldn't Penelope feel guilty about the fact that one of these slave women who's murdered is Melantho, the woman that she's raised like a daughter. Of course, Penelope has trouble with her teenage children, including both Telemachus and Melantho. They talk back to her, and she doesn't like it. And so we have the scene of Melantho speaking and Penelope shutting her up, and then Melantho ends up with the noose around her neck. So is Penelope complicit in those murders? But we never get to see that.
It's such a strange thing because you've got this, the smoke being put in the house so it'll smell good again after all this blood. I mean, it's quite brutally done. So you do wonder at her lack of response. Well, I could go on asking you questions forever, but we're a little bit pressed for time. So I'm going to open to the audience. And we should have some ushers who will bring microphones, and I'm going to let the ushers see hands. Here's one down here. If you wouldn't mind waiting for the mic, because we record these for podcasts. Thank you.
I'm so happy to be here and to learn more about your process, and I'm so glad that you read the section about Argos, which is one of my favorite sections, and I just have some questions about it, and I'm wanting to learn a little bit more. I think you mentioned in your introduction a little bit about the significance of dogs in ancient Greek culture. And so I'm wondering about that scene, because it seems like it's a scene where you don't have to have it.
No, you don't.
Yes.
But they have it.
Yes.
So I'm just curious about maybe what resonances that scene might have had for an ancient Greek culture versus now. I think I'm learning a little bit more about the connection between slavery and Argos, but I'm just curious to hear from you a little bit more about that scene.
Yes, that's a great question. So there are lots of dogs, both metaphorical and literal, in the Odyssey. I think maybe I'll just say two things that I think are really important about why I have that scene. One thing that it does is that it measures time, right? It makes Odysseus has this constant fantasy that he can come back not just to his old house, his old marriage, but his old self, his old position in the household. Even though 20 years have passed, it's as if they haven't passed. Telemachus is still very young. The father is still alive. Everything can be exactly as it was before. Argos is a reminder that no, that's on some level that doesn't work. 20 years actually have passed, and that's the end for Argos. So it marks the fact that there really is a gap in terms of the time. And then the other thing is just about the whole question of who is loyal or not loyal within the household. The most loyal of all, of course, is Argos. Because how can you be totally identified with the interests of your owner? No slave, however loyal, can be that way. So I think it's really interesting that it's within that context of a discussion of what does it mean to be a slave. In itself, it's articulating a kind of double standard about slavery, right? That slavery takes away half your value. So you're a good slave only if you're not a slave. So then what do you have to be? Either you have to be a noble person, not a slave at all, or else you have to be an animal, not a human at all. So I think it's sort of pointing to the poem's really interestingly contradictory ideas about slavery and class and status, as well as about time and the fantasies of whether you can either stop time or not.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that was a wonderful reading. I hope you'll do it in recorded books. I'm tempted to ask you the question.
Doing it instead.
I'm tempted to ask you, this is not my question, but I'm tempted to ask you to relate the Trojan horse episode to Brexit. But my question is double in this. I think it was Peter Brown, the classical scholar, who said that you cannot understand these things unless you read them in the original language. There is such a massive difference. And because I don't read Greek, I'm tempted to read your translation. But was it Peter Brown, and is that true?
Every language embodies a different way of thinking. And that's, of course, true, all the more so for a language which comes from 3,000 years ago. I don't think that means you can't get any access whatsoever to how do people think and feel and imagine in archaic Greece. It's just that it's definitely a different thing. And I'm conscious that my translation, however much I try to be ultra responsible about grappling with the original, I know that it's a very, very different text, as every translation is. But I don't think that means it's not worthwhile to try and get some glimmering of what it was like and what this poem is like.
And yet there are many things you didn't. I mean, there are many stringencies you observed, that the length of the thing, and you wouldn't just add a. You were saying you would not just add a response of Penelope where it wasn't in the original.
Right, and I don't have Penelope run off with Calypso or any other possible fun ending. Yes.
This is probably a question for the end of the conversation, but are you going to translate the Iliad, and are you going to translate the Aeneid?
Oh, I'm not thinking that far ahead. The Iliad's already quite a big project, but I'm going to do the Iliad.
Great.
Thanks. It is great.
So thank you for. Hi.
Talking.
Oh,
Hi, sorry.
With the dog.
Dog. I really enjoyed the voices that you used when you had the different characters speaking. Oh, sorry. And I was wondering how much of that you felt when you were translating from the Greek. How much of that came out in the context of that, of translating it, or versus like you reading the translation and then kind of finding a voice that fit for that translation.
Yes, I mean, so when I was just reading out loud to myself while I was working on my drafts in progress, I didn't always do the hamming it up in the same way that I do if there's an audience. But I think the attempt to try and do different voices for different characters is sort of intertwined with my project of trying to make sure that even if you just read it as a text, that there's a visibility to there are different perspectives in this poem. And that's a way, and putting on different voices is a way of dramatizing that feature of the text, which I think is essential to what I was trying to do in the translation. And I think it also relates to your question about how was I trying to think through each character's narrative arc. Part of thinking through each character's narrative arc, implicit in that is, so how might they talk? And I wish I had more different voices I could do, because I run up against limits to how many posh voices, how many not posh voices, how many male voices do I actually have. I need actually several more of each category than I have. But
Perhaps next year you'll come back to the Hammer and we'll dramatize the whole thing.
That'd be great. With
That'd be
real
great.
actors, that'd be good. Yes. Yes.
We have time for just a few more questions.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to thank you for this, your presentation as a whole. It really was is excellent and very interesting. I, as a philologist myself and a polylear and polyglot, I really have spent my whole life in this world very much like yours, except that mine is in Egyptology and French and so forth, rather than Greek. But I always have taken the universalist view of that it's always possible to translate something meaningfully, because we're in one existence, except that every unique language is also a unique and irreplaceable facet. But that being said, I was wondering how it is that you approach and what your views are essentially on those things and those quirks, as it were, of language, and as you were talking about as well, as of context, in terms of trying to bring that forward in a way that makes sense. For instance, you had brought up a point about the term slave as opposed to maidservant or manservant or so forth. But I don't know the context in Athens or in Greece, in pre-Athens actually, rather, at the time, what in Troy and what these things, whether they would have been seen as culturally interchangeable terms or not. I know in Egypt they would be to an extent, but I don't know if that's true here. And if they were there subtleties of a difference in either context or by root word chosen, where we're not necessarily translating it that way actually could change the meaning in some sense, and just what your view on that sort of thing is. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot to say on that cluster of things. And I know I can't give as long an answer as I potentially could. I think the whole question of how every language has its own embeddedness in a particular culture. So then when you try and translate, it's not just, do I know what this word means, what the dictionary says? It's also, how can I convey something that's somehow equivalent in my totally different culture? So just about slave, the word slave in English connotes moral evil. We know that slavery is wrong. We all know that, at least in theory, even though we have slavery in the modern world too. But within the context of both archaic and classical antiquity, the language of slavery doesn't connote moral evil. It connotes totally normal institution that nobody thinks about because it's so normal. So that, of course, is problematic, right? If you use a word like demoos, which does suggest enslaved, not free person, but also suggests, in brackets, and that's fine. That's different from if you use the word slave, which suggests not free person, and we hate that. And I don't think there's any way around that. I think the other alternative is to use a word that we are okay with, like maidservant, but then it has the wrong referent. So I think there's just a sort of gap between what can you do. You can make either of these choices, and neither one of them is going to actually take you back in the time machine to antiquity. And maybe it's a good thing in certain ways.
Over on this side. Loved your reading, loved your translation, and you really bring it so alive. Book 19 has always been one of my favorites, and I think you really captured that whole bob and weaving between the stranger and Penelope, and it's so nicely done. Were there, in the Greek, in your translation, were there certain words that you were playing with that were giving you kind of clues on how you wanted to convey it, and then some choices you made in the translation? Because you really brought it to life, and I've read a lot of the translations.
Oh, thank you so much. That's such a lovely comment as well as question. I love book 19 as well. I mean, I guess one detail is just that I was very, very much invested in trying to make sure that the central ambiguity about is he calling her a woman, is he calling her a wife, when Odysseus is constantly addressing Penelope as guner, which in Greek suggests both woman and wife. But I really wanted to play around with that ambiguity and think through when is he going to use the word wife? When am I going to use enjambment to make sure that the reader is hanging on to? Is it going to come? Are we going to have the revelation now? Is it going to keep on getting postponed? Yeah. Yeah.
Just really quickly, in keeping with the previous question, after you studied Greek, but before Norton asked you to translate this, did you find yourself really frustrated by the translations that you had studied or that you reread?
You must have taught them sometimes.
Well, so a colleague of mine teaches the big mythology class, so I very rarely had to teach the whole thing in translation. And so it was actually more at the time of having to choose a text for the anthologies that I really wrestled with the sense that I didn't think any of them were very satisfactory for that purpose. I mean, I'd fairly frequently taught classes which were my own invention of mix of different things from classical literature, but I usually avoided having the whole Odyssey because my colleague teaches a class which has it in. So I didn't want to have the same students at the same university be made to read the whole Odyssey in translation multiple times. But I was definitely aware that that I didn't feel 100% confident about wanting to recommend any one of the ones that I was putting in the anthology.
I loved your reading, and I was also intrigued with the different voices. And my question had to do with epic, the genre and poetry, which I think is really hard for us to grasp because lyric is so dominant. And so I wanted to ask a couple of questions that maybe seem a little bit anomalous, but I wonder if they got to the question of what epic is like. And one of them is that moment in the Siren episode where the song is described as honey sweet and another product of the bees' work. Beeswax is the thing that makes that plugs their ears, so that the song, both the hearing of the song and the not being able to hear the song, comes from the same source. And the sirens sing in dactylic hexameter. And I just wondered if that, might be something telling about epic. And the other question is maybe related, but that Sophocles describes the Sphinx as a rhapsode, and that the riddle of the Sphinx is also written in dactylic hexameters. And I've always been just so puzzled and wondrous about this idea of the epic singer, that the Sphinx is described as an epic singer. So I had those two questions about the beeswax and the honey sweetness of the song and the...
Those are wonderful observations. I'm doing a translation of Oedipus Tyrannos right now, and I'm really struggling with what to say about the rhapsoidos Sphinx. So to what extent, in what way exactly is she an aioidos? In fact, she's an aioidos, not a rhapsode. In fact, she's both in different moments. That she's some kind of maker of song as well as a performer of the songs of others. You're absolutely right that there's this association in the siren sequence with bees and the products of bees, which I think is to do with how the siren songs are unlike human songs. They're the products of nature, and of course the sirens are often depicted in archaic and classical culture as bird women. But there seems to be this sort of flipping between, are they birds, are they bees? Which kind of animal that might produce sweetness and song and fly around are they? And I think that's different from what does the poem say about the human epic tradition, because the sirens are offering something which is different and much more encyclopedic than what either Phemius or Demodocus can give the dinner guests within the narrative of the Odyssey. I feel like I'm not quite sure where to locate the essence of the question. The bees' work is a natural product as opposed to the human poet's work, which comes through the retellings of multiple different people, right? The bees don't have to learn. Yes.
These questions are so good. I've probably let us run away with the time a little bit, but let's do one more.
Professor Wilson, thank you. I have the sense that there's a certain kind of exhaustion and sterility in translation theory and a real vitality in translation. And what I see being born as I listen to you is a different theoretical posture, actually, which is talking back. That was the phrase that you used, talking back, or even shouting back. Having a woman basically take the tradition to task is fantastic. I mean, do you feel that's what you're doing? I mean, that's what I hear you doing. It's absolutely fresh, it's absolutely new. There's a real power to it that I don't think the conventional run-of-the-mill translations ever have. That's what I hear. Am I getting you right?
So nobody has yet asked about my being a woman, so maybe I should talk about that a little bit. I don't know.
Go for it.
Yes, I mean, so of course a lot of the publicity about this translation has hinged on that, and on it's the first translation into English by a woman. Of course, there've been lots into other languages by women, not all of which talk back, I think, at all. Not all women are feminists. Not all women are interested in gender. Not all women are interested in sort of unpicking how exactly are the social relationships working in this text. So I don't see that as sort of inevitable. But I do definitely... I guess I'm hesitating because I think it's not just about translation, right? It's also about... what's your mode of literary criticism? My mode of literary criticism involves some element of both trying to inhabit the text and think with it, but then also think about its fault lines, think about how does it contradict itself and not make sense, where does it present contradictory voices. And that's the same kind of thing I'm trying to bring out as a translator that I'm also trying to bring out when I write as a scholar. So it's not clear to me that it's necessarily a totally different mode, but it's of course a very, very different thing to be doing it in poetry as opposed to doing it in prose.
Thank you so much. And Emily will be with us a little bit longer. We'll go upstairs and right out to the right. We'll have cookies and coffee and tea and books, which she will sign.